Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradari Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradari Yashananda Jana
around here. Yamuna Tira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Hare Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Jaya Prabhupada, Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada. Jaya Om Vishnupad, Paramahamsa Paramahansa Tadasata Shri Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam Great. Hey Sri Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada Ki. Ananta Koti Vaishnava Ki. Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam Ki. Amalena Bhaktivedanta Ki. Gaur Premanandi. All glories to the Semala devotees. All glories to the Semala devotees. All glories to the Semala devotees. All glories to Shri Shri Guru and Shri Gauranga. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
It's 2:08.
25.
25. Okay, I'm one chapter ahead. Oh, thank you. Om Ajnanatimidandasya Ghananjana Shalakaya Chakshur Unmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamahyam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavam Cha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatan Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhunam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakanvitamscha. Hey Krishna Karuna Sindho Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavan Eshvari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpa Tarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Okay, so 2.8.25. Atra pramanam hi bhavan. Atra pramanam hi bhavan. Parameshtiyatatma bhu. Parameshtiyatatma bhu. Apare chanutishtanti. Apare chanutishtanti. Purvesham purvajayakritam. Purvesham purvajayakritam. Atra pramanam hi bhavan. Parameshtiyatatma bhu. Apare chanutishtanti. purvesham purvajayakritam
Purvesham purvajayakritam
atra pramanam hi bhavan parameshti yatatmabhu apare chanutishtanti purvesham purvajayakritam atra pramanam hi bhavan parameshti yatatmabhu apare chanutishtanti purvesham purvajayakritam atra pramanam hi bhavan parameshti yatatmabhu apare chanutishtanti purvesham purvajayakritam atra. In this matter, pramanam, evidential facts. He, certainly. Bhavan, yourself. Parameshti, Brahma, the creator of the universe. Yatha, as. Atmabhuhu, born directly from the Lord. Apare, others. Cha, only. Anutishtanti, just to follow. Purvesham, as a matter of custom. Purvajayi, knowledge suggested by a previous philosopher. Kritam, having been done. So the translation reads, O great sage, you are as good as Brahma, the original living being. Others follow custom only, as followed by the previous philosophical speculators. So I say, and you please repeat, O great sage, you are as good as Brahma, the original living being. Others follow custom only, as followed by the previous philosophical speculators. All right, so the purport reads, it may be argued that Shukadeva Goswami is not the only authority of perfect knowledge in the transcendence, because there are many other sages and their followers contemporary to Vyasadeva, or even prior to him. There were many other great sages such as Gautama, Karnada, Jaimini, Kapila, and Ashtavakra. And all of them have presented a philosophical path by themselves. Patanjali is also one of them. And all these 6 great rishis have their own way of thinking, exactly like the modern philosophers and mental speculators. The difference between the 6 philosophical paths put forward by the renowned sages above mentioned and that of Shukadeva Goswami as presented by the Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam is that the 6 sages, all of them mentioned above, speak the facts according to their own philosophical thinking. But Shukadeva Goswami presents the knowledge which comes down directly from Brahmaji, who is known as Atmabhu, or born of and educated by the Almighty Personality of Godhead. Vedic transcendental knowledge descends directly from the Personality of Godhead. By his mercy, Brahma, the first living being in the universe, was enlightened. And from Brahmaji, Narada was enlightened. And from Narada, Vyasadeva was enlightened. Shukadeva Goswami received such transcendental knowledge directly from his father, Vyasadeva. Thus, the knowledge being received from the chain of disciplic succession is perfect. One cannot be a spiritual master in perfection unless and until one has received the same by disciplic succession. That is the secret of receiving transcendental knowledge. The 6 great sages mentioned above may be great thinkers, but their knowledge by mental speculation is not perfect. However, perfect an empiric philosopher may be in presenting a philosophical thesis, such knowledge is never perfect because it is produced by an imperfect mind. Such great sages also have their disciplic successions, but they are not authorized because such knowledge does not come directly from the independent Supreme Personality of Godhead, Narayan. No one can be independent except Narayan. Therefore, no one's knowledge can be perfect, for everyone's knowledge is dependent on the flickering mind. Mind is material, and thus knowledge presented by the material speculators is never transcendental and can never become perfect. Mundane philosophers, being imperfect in themselves, disagree with other philosophers because a mundane philosopher is not a philosopher at all unless he presents his own theory. Intelligent persons like Maharaj Pariksit do not recognize such mental speculators, however great they may be, but hear from authorities like Shukadeva Goswami, who is non-different from the Supreme Personality of Godhead by the Parampara system, as is specially stressed in Bhagavad Gita. Atra pramanam hi bhavan parameshti yatatma bhu apare chanutishtanti purvesham purvajaykritam. O great sage, you are as good as Brahma, the original living being. Others follow custom only, as followed by previous philosophical speculators. So we mentioned before that this chapter, chapter 8, is broken into 3 sections. The first 6 verses, they describe the glorification of Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam by Pariksit. And then from 7 through 24, which was yesterday's verse, is the section where Pariksit asks various questions. There's a whole ream of questions that he asks. We kind of discussed a little bit this huge collection of questions that he raises. Then from 24 through 29, which is where we are now, we have this bit where Pariksit begs Shukadeva Goswami to please answer his questions, and we kind of get the lead into the questions being answered actually by Shukadeva Goswami, which actually begins more appropriately or more completely in chapter 9, which is the next chapter. So, as Bhaktivinoda Thakur mentions in his Tattva Vivek, one may ask the basic philosophical questions: who am I, what is this world, and what is my connection with this world? And immediately one will become aware that there are a multiplicity of answers to this question. There are many, many answers. And therefore, many people give up I think, why should I bother trying to study anything about the nature of the world around me when there's so many different answers to the questions? And the different philosophers, they compete with one another, and they try to tear down each other's philosophy. So Prabhupada doesn't quote it here, but this Mahabharata from, I'm trying to remember what parva it is, but it's a verse is quoted by Yudhishthira, actually, to his father, who is, appeared to him in a mysterious yaksha form. And that verse is Tarko Pratishta Shruyato Vibhina Nasa Vrishir Yasya Matam Nibinam Dharmasya Tattvam Nihitam Guhaya Mahajano Yenagata Sapanta. So that verse is quoted by Yudhishthira when the yaksha asks, how can real knowledge be had? And this is an actually interesting answer to that question. Why are there many different answers to philosophical questions, and how can we know which one to accept? Tarko Pratishta means that dry arguments are never effective. They don't stand. Pratishta means to stand up. Pratishta means to fall. So dry arguments fall. Tarko Pratishta. Shruyato Vibhina. The Vedas themselves have many different tributaries and branches. So we can get caught up in these various different explanations. Nasa vrishir yasya matam nabinam, that, as Prabhupada puts in the purport here, a sage is not considered to be a sage unless his philosophy contradicts previous philosophy. So a person who is a great thinker or a great muni cannot be accepted unless his philosophy contradicts other munis. And this has been the MO of philosophers all throughout the ages, especially in the modern era, where each philosopher laid down something new, something that cut at the previous understandings. And yet, we see that none of them have made any lasting effect on the world. We have so many philosophers, from, you know, the ancient philosophers up to, you know, the Greeks and their understanding of the four elements that they accepted. Then we move into the more modern time where we have the, idealists, the German idealists, and we have the English empiricists, and then we move into the, French and English and even American existentialists. So we have all these different philosophers, one after another, each one coming up with some philosophy that seemed to be quite the thing during their time, but none of them stood the test of time. I mean, how many people actually know what Kant or Hegel taught? How many people know what Camus or Sartre, what they actually were up to? We have left these people behind. Philosophy has gone by the wayside because people have become frustrated by these various competing answers. So now people look towards science and they think science will answer all the questions. But it's humorous that science actually omits or sidesteps all the important questions that we want to know. Now, this succession of philosophers after philosophers after philosophers has been going on since time immemorial. And indeed, the actual parampara has also been going on since time immemorial. But it comes from Krishna, and as we hear that from Krishna we go to Brahma, then from Brahma we go to Narada, and then, you know, from Narada we go to Veda Vyas, and so on and so forth. So that's the ancient part of the parampara. But if we look at what happened in India, we find an interesting story, that there is the ancient system, which was the Vedas, and those philosophies which agree with Vedic philosophy are called Astika philosophies, and that comes from the Sanskrit asti, which means to be or to be so. Asti means that something is so. And they're gradually developed these other philosophies that debated the Vedic conclusion, and they were called Nasti philosophies. And I wonder whether that's where we get our word nasty, but Nasti means na asti, is not so. So they refute the Vedic philosophy. But before those philosophers ever came on the scene, which was roughly about 800 or so BC, we start seeing these Nasti philosophies, starting with Buddha, who is sometimes said to be around 800 BC, or sometimes more recently at 600 BC, or thereabouts. So there were these 5, or if we add Vyasadeva, 6 darshans. And these philosophies are a part of the Vedic system. But as time progressed, these different 6 darshans became competitors with one another. And they also became deviated from their original explanations that they were actually supposed to do. In his book, you know, about the Saddarshan, Suhotra describes that we have the 4 Vedas, the Rig, Sama, Atharva, and Yajurveda. And in ancient times, a student was supposed to study all 4 of those, and those 4 are called the Samhitas together. And later on, one studied the Brahmanas, which are various sacrifices for being able to perform various yagyas. Then when someone took Vanaprastha and was getting ready for renounced life, they would study the Aranyakas, which are the various Vedic formulas for renunciation. And finally, one would come to investigate the Upanishads. And there one would actually get the first taste of actual philosophy, because so far all we've talked about is various demigods and various sacrifices that were offered. But in the Upanishads we get the first look at actual philosophy. The Vedas start explaining. And in the Upanishads we hear about this mysterious Supreme Lord that we don't know much about. It's not really described very deeply in the Upanishads. Instead, many conclude that the Supreme Lord is formless as a result of the Upanishads. But the Upanishads do hint at the Lord having a form, particularly the Ishyo Upanishad, which describes, please remove that dazzling effulgence covering your face. I want to see your face. So in the Ishyo Upanishad, there is an indication that the Supreme Lord indeed does have a form. So this Ishyo Upanishad begins to look at something deeper. Now, these studies, as we said, the Samhitas, Rig, Sama, Atharva, Yajur, the Brahmanas, the Aranyakas, and the Upanishads, constitute what is known as the category of Smriti Shastras. So these are the ones that are, or Shruti Shastras, I'm sorry, Shruti Shastras, the ones that are heard. Now, beyond them, there are other literatures which are called Smriti. So there's Shruti and Smriti. Shruti is that which is heard, Smriti is that which is remembered. So these Smriti Shastras, that's where these other darshans come from. And there's a succession to them too. So we have what's known as Nyaya or logic, and that progresses into Vaisheshika, and Vaisheshika progresses into Sankhya, Sankhya progresses into Yoga, and Yoga progresses into Karma Mimamsa. And alongside all these 6 darshans, or these 5 darshans that I've mentioned just now, there is Vedanta darshan, which is the original teaching that Vedavyas brought. So Vedavyas was not a speculator, as these others were. He was bringing the disciplic succession. The other 5 darshans originally were connected and were originally theistic, but as time progressed, they became more and more divorced from the original understanding of the Vedas. So what Nyaya does, which is kind of central professor, or the central person who explains Nyaya, is Gautama. So Gautama is the professor of Nyaya, and Nyaya sets up rules for speech and argumentation, very similar to what the Greeks did in some ways. It sets up what are actual substances, how one should argue, what is a good argument, what is a bad argument. So that's what Nyaya is about. Then we move to, if one finishes and understands clearly Nyaya, then one usually progresses on to the next step, which is the Vaisheshika philosophy, which fleshes things out a little bit more. And Vaisheshika philosophy explains that there are atoms, that everything in the material world is broken down into tiny atoms. And these atoms are, in and of themselves, the building blocks of everything that we see. And therefore, if one tries to understand or just become involved with matter, one will be frustrated because these atoms are always changing and always in flux. So that brings one to the next level, which is what we call Sankhya philosophy. And Sankhya deals with 24 elements. And that tells us more than just the atoms, and it describes the fact that there are interactions between 24 elements, and these interactions are, if properly understood, will give us an overview of the world that we live in, how it functions. And once one is very carefully schooled in Sankhya philosophy, we move on to Karma Mimamsa. We move on to Yoga. Yoga is the system by Patanjali, So Gautama was the main professor of Nyaya or logic, and Karnada was the main professor of Vaisheshika. Kapila was the main professor of Sankhya, but Kapila, the original Kapila, taught the theistic Sankhya, whereas the atheist Kapila, who lived much later than the original Kapila, he taught an atheistic version of Sankhya. And the yoga system was given by Patanjali. The idea of the yoga system is by performing various physical activities, various postures, one would eventually develop a steadiness of mind, a clearness of mind where the senses were completely suppressed. And one could connect with the Supreme within the Supersoul in the heart. Now, beyond that, finally, we have the Jaimini version of the Karma Mimamsa philosophy. So Karma Mimamsa is about various karmas, as the name suggests. So the idea in Karma Mimamsa philosophy is that one does various activities, and if one performs one's duty or occupation properly, then everything will be satisfied. So that's Karma Mimamsa. So these 5 philosophies gradually became atheistic, and they became divorced from one another, and they became divorced from the actual intent of the Vedas. And that's why we don't accept them in the way they're generally taught. However, each of these does have a place in genuine Vaishnava philosophy. There is a genuine Sankhya, there is a genuine logic, there is a genuine understanding of Sankhya, there is a genuine understanding of yoga. All these things are, in fact, genuine, but the way they're usually taught is not at all genuine. It's usually atheistic. So the Vedanta, or the actual teaching of Vedavyasa, is not speculative, because he is giving it to us through the disciplic succession. And it describes the Supreme Lord. It doesn't go around him. It describes the Supreme Lord and helps us to connect with him through devotional service. The problem with these speculative philosophies is that these speculative philosophies appear to offer something, but actually they don't. They simply cause a person to try for mundane happiness in the material world, or to try to merge with the Brahman, usually. That's what mostly the yoga system tries to merge with the Supersoul. But the process of spiritual life is really more than this. The Supreme Lord makes the world in such a complicated way that these philosophies appear to offer something. But if you study these philosophies or you embrace these philosophies, you will not actually get any spiritual realization, and you will not be happy. Even if you manage to merge with Brahman, you will have to come out of that connection with Brahman at some point, because it is not an eternal position. So therefore, as Prabhupada says in this purport, when we hear from Parampara, we are safe. There's Guru, Sadhu, and Shastra. When something is underlined and reiterated from 3 different sources, from Guru, Sadhu, and Shastra, then we know we have solid truth. If it is not the same that we hear from Guru, Sadhu, and Shastra, then we're suspicious of this information. Because try as they may, those who try to, what's called the Aroha Panta, the rising, ascending process, you try to understand the universe through your own mind, that will always fail. So rather we follow the Avaroha Panta, the descending process, through disciplic succession. We learn from authorities like Vedavyas, like Narada, like the Parampara. So as these 5 philosophies began to compete with one another and become atheistic, a new philosophy entered, and that was Buddhism. And Buddhism was Nasti, it was atheistic. And not only atheistic, but nihilistic, actually. And that happened somewhere in 800 BC or 600 BC, somewhere around that time. And these other philosophies, the 6 darshans, they tried to suppress Buddhism, but Buddhism began to gain a foothold. And by 250 BC, at the point of Emperor Ashoka, at that time Emperor Ashoka embraced Buddhism, and most of India became Buddhist at that point. So Emperor Ashoka, because he was a very powerful emperor, he gave the facilities of the state to the process of Buddhism, and therefore India became Buddhist at that time. And that lasted past the time of Jesus Christ, or 0 AD, up till about 500 or 600. There's also some controversy there. When we have Shankaracharya who comes in, and Shankaracharya preaches the Mayavad philosophy, which is very similar to Buddhism, but it includes the Brahman, which Buddhism does not include. Then we have the incursion of the Muslims, which is around 800 AD. Then in about 1000 AD, around that point, we have the Alvars, and we begin to get actual Vaishnava philosophy back again. So by the 15th century, 16th century, we have Chaitanya, who puts things back into perspective again. So this is kind of an overview of the history of how these things move from one to another. And the ascending path will always fail because it's based on speculation. The descending path will succeed because it's based on actual disciplic succession knowledge. And as Bhaktivinoda Thakur says in Tattva Vivek, that there are many answers to these questions, but the answers which do not come in parampara, such answers are imperfect answers, and that's why they compete with one another. That's why there's always a contest. But those who are situated in the parampara, those who are situated in this disciplic succession, their answers do not compete with one another, and they always give the same answer because it is coming from parampara. So that's the difference between the parampara system, or the avaroha, the descending path. The descending path is called aporosheya. That means it's not coming from a human. Purusha means human or man. Aparosheya means that it's not coming from a man. The problem with human knowledge is it's compounded with 4 defects. The tendency to make mistakes, the tendency to have imperfect senses, the tendency to be an illusion, and the tendency to cheat. So all human philosophies have these 4 unfortunate qualities, and therefore they're called Purusheya. They're coming from a human. But the philosophy of spiritual life, the Vaishnava philosophy, which is handed down through disciplic succession, is apurusheya. It's not coming. And it's also avaroha. It's descending. It's not ascending. All right, so that's quite a lot of stuff. But it kind of is hinted at in this purport. So I'll ask if there are any questions or comments. I'm sorry I went longer than I should have, yes.
So the disciple, you say apurusheya, right? Apurusheya, you say?
Yeah. That,
so is that like basically everlasting, meaning like there's somebody that's actually living in our time right now that's an apurusheya, like, you know, meaning God is with them or something, or her, or it?
yes. The knowledge is eternal. When we talk about how the universe is created and how to get out of it, that is Vedic knowledge. That's true Vedic knowledge. And it's called apurusheya because it wasn't created by the fertile mind of a human being. It was created by the Supreme. And indeed, Vedavyas, who wrote the Vedas, is still living. He wrote the Vedas 5,000 years ago.
So you're saying that there is somebody that's basically living in this time?
Yes.
Because that's my question, is like, you know, the disciples, you know, the discipleship succession, right? That's the whole, the Bhagavad Gita basically is about. So it's like, you know, I'm wondering if like, so you're saying that there's a person that's basically, you know, that is living in our time, that is actually basically Krishna.
Yes, Vedavyas is the literary incarnation of Krishna. So he wrote the Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam, among other things. You know, he wrote them down. He didn't create the Vedas, he simply wrote them down, or he was the one that transcribed them. As we say, this is not created by any human. It is the words of the Supreme Lord. They were spoken to Brahma from Krishna when Brahma was given the first knowledge.
So there is actually somebody right now that's Krishna. Somebody here in this time, in this place. Not in this place, but in our reality.
Yes.
According to that, right?
Well, Vedavyas is...
Krishna in person.
Krishna, Vedavyas is not Krishna, he's a Shaktavesha avatar. So he is the literary incarnation. So Vedavyas is described.
Well, that's what I mean, because, you know, the whole Bhagavad Gita is based on that, you know, principle that because, you know, whoever the avatar is Krishna, that's basically that avatar is Krishna. That's basically what I understand.
Krishna has avatars,
right.
But there is not an avatar presently other than the holy name. Right, right.
Then if that discipleship, you know, succession, then so that you're saying then that there is nobody that's a disciple that's handed down that, you know, that
there is.
knowledge.
There is. Just try to understand.
Basically Krishna himself.
Yeah, just try to understand that the knowledge is passed from guru to disciple. Now, the guru and disciple both are humans.
When you say knowledge, I'm sorry to, you know, because when you bring stuff like that, I'm asking a question, not to be disrespectful, cut off, but, you know, because there's a question that comes with, when you say knowledge, what do you mean by knowledge? Like power,
Vedic knowledge.
Spiritual, magic, mystic.
Right. We're talking about Vedic knowledge. We're not talking about all kinds of mundane knowledge. We're talking about Vedic knowledge of spiritual life.
I mean, this is right. Yeah.
Right. So that was spoken from Krishna, who is the Supreme directly, to Brahma. Now, Brahma is not the Supreme. He's a person. He's a very powerful person. He's a demigod. But then Brahma spoke it to Narada, who's also not the Supreme, but he's also a great devotee. And then Narada taught it to Vedavyas, and Vedavyas is the literary incarnation. Again, he's a person. He's not Krishna. He's an empowered incarnation of Krishna. And then we go from later on to, Madhvacharya, and then we get into modern times, So the disciplic succession is handed from guru to disciple, and the guru is teaching and the disciple is hearing. The guru is a person, a human being, and the disciple is a human being. But the knowledge is coming from God, and it's not become tainted or skewed or misrepresented or parts left out or parts added. It is being given verbatim the way it was originally taught.
So basically Krishna himself, that knowledge is...
Right. It's coming from Krishna, and since it hasn't been adulterated, it's the same thing that Krishna taught. And this is what we call disciplic succession.
So maybe this is kind of off your topic, but do you think that Jesus Christ was a disciple of Krishna? Like, he was, he done miracles and stuff like that?
What's that?
Jesus Christ, was basically one of the disciples, right?
Well, Jesus taught the same philosophy. He taught the same philosophy. What his disciplic succession is, I don't know, but obviously he was in line, and Prabhupada said that Jesus taught basic Vaishnavism. But any rate, just to sort of finish up that thought, that the disciplic succession is what makes the knowledge a Purusheya. It's not that it's taught by people who are God, it's taught by people who are devotees, but they are repeating the words of God. And that's what makes it a Purusheya. You had a question.
Yeah, thank you for the wonderful class, Mark. I was wondering if you could go over, when you spoke about different types of yogas and how people nowadays do this, hatha type of yoga.
Mm-hmm.
And my question was more so like, when we're on book distribution, even just yesterday in Washington Square Park, I was approaching some people and telling them about how these books talk about, bhakti yoga and the ultimate form of yoga, and their only response would be, "Oh, that's okay. I already have my yoga.
Mm-hmm.
It's already perfect." So, like, how can we make people understand the power of bhakti yoga and how it's the ultimate form?
Yeah, well, there are many different kinds of yoga, as you were saying. And we have to ask people, what is the purpose of yoga? That's, whenever you do something, you should know, what is it supposed to do for you? What's the goal of it, And when you ask what the goal of it is, then you'll find that generally, in the modern day, when people talk about hatha yoga, they're talking about a yoga that is designed to give them good health and to, stretch their muscles in such a way that they're very limber, and it will help them in their physical, day-to-day life, But that's not the goal of yoga, That's certainly the goal of modern yoga. And even many people take yoga because they're convinced it will help them enjoy sex better, which is certainly not the goal of yoga, but it's certainly the goal of modern yoga, or at least it's a golden fringe benefit of modern yoga. At any rate, whatever a person does, you can ask them, well, what's the goal? What's the best goal that a human being can aspire to? What can we actually try to go for? I mean, what's the best thing? And that most people start scratching their heads at that point because they've never really thought about it, What's worth the most important goal? What's the thing that if we did this one thing, our lives would be successful, and if we didn't do it, our lives would be useless? So what is it, And when you set people thinking like that, a lot of people have never given it a second thought at all. And then you begin to realize that you can tell them, well, what's the most important thing? To understand and connect with God. You know, if a person's not interested in God, then you probably aren't talking to them anyway. You know, they've already gone down the street, you know, and they're 2 blocks away by that point. But the people who you're still talking to, when you ask them, well, the purpose of the most important thing in the universe or in a person's life is to understand God. So if we understand God, that means we develop a relationship with Him. That means we develop an affection for God. And then we begin to see that these other goals, like some kind of abstract knowledge, you know, sometimes people think the goal of life is just to be knowledgeable in some abstract way. Well, what's the purpose of that? You know, you can go on learning forever, but not all kinds of knowledge are equal. We can learn the life cycle of crickets or something like that, but, you know, that doesn't really do much for you in your everyday life. You know, it's certainly knowledge, but it's not important knowledge. And so what we're asking is, what is the ultimate goal? Where you try to get a person to try to focus on what is the ultimate goal? What's the best goal? The summum bonum, as the Latin is, you know. So when we start thinking about that, we learn that it is the Supreme Lord, developing relationship, understanding the Supreme Lord. And then will your yoga, Hatha yoga, do that? And the answer is no. Technically, if you follow the full Ashtanga yoga system, you could do that. But most people don't understand the full Ashtanga yoga system, nor is it taught in the modern day. You know, the Hatha system is only step 3 in the 8-fold yoga. Ashtanga, Ashta means 8. So the first step is yam, and the second is niyam, and the third is Hatha yoga. So that's the 3rd step. And the 4th step is, you know, pranayam, and then there's pratyahara, then there's dharana and dhyana, and finally samadhi. So there are these other following steps. But most people don't, in the Western world, in the modern times, they don't follow or practice the entire yoga system. They just practice one part, the Hatha system. They leave out the first 2 parts, yam and niyam, and they don't worry about part 4 through 8. They leave those out too. So it's just a piece of the actual original yoga system. Okay, so any rate, thank you all very much for your kind attention. Anybody else have a question though? Okay, so all glories to Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam, all glories to the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord. Hare Krishna.